Welcome to Educate to Self-Regulate, a podcast for educational leaders, teachers, and students, where in less than 20 minutes, we unpack educational research to support you and your students to become better learners.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Educate to Self-Regulate. I'm joined here today with the lovely Rebecca Birch. Now, Rebecca is a fellow educator and researcher, and as something we've been trying to do on the podcast is to bring in guests that can share or shed some light on different aspects of self-regulated learning. So, Rebecca, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Shyam.
Rebecca, as I understand it, you're juggling quite a lot of things. I was looking at your LinkedIn profile and there's academic in residence at Queenwood. And then from our last conversation, you're doing research as well. So you've got multiple hats on. Would you mind telling our audience a little bit about your journey in the education profession and where you're at right now in your current work?
So I retrained to become a teacher when I was about 40 because I used to work in fashion and advertising, and I had this realization that I wasn't really saving any lives. So I started to retrain and decided along that journey to become an English teacher because that's where I thought I'd have the most impact. I've worked in independent schools for about 10 years, mostly with girls during that time. There's only a couple of years of not working with girls. And my previous role at Queenwood was Director of Research and Practice, where I was responsible for whole school projects and teacher professional learning. I've taken a step back this year to focus on PhD studies. So now I'm academic in residence at Queenwood, which is a great role. It's where I get to stay in touch with a lot of those whole school research-based projects and work on my PhD as well, which is in the non-academic benefits of explicit instruction.
Amazing. Gosh, okay, well, there's so many questions emerging for me, Rebecca, about your work. But the reason we're here today is because Queen would have been doing some interesting work in the space of self-regulated learning. And last year, they published a report, the Smart Study Report 2024, which is publicly available for people to read. And it came across my desk. And I was very fascinated to hear that the school has been doing kind of this 3-year study in the space of self-regulated learning. Maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview and what was the motivation behind it?
We obviously know a bit about academic stress, but it's particularly prevalent in girls. And independent school students have the highest dropout rates at university of any sector, which is really fascinating. And I think that's partly because I think independent schools take good care of students academically and with their socio-emotional learning. But then when they leave school, they're not necessarily equipped to deal with the rigors of study and the competing demands that university might throw up. So our project arose from an observed problem with girls presenting with academic stress, saying things like, I don't know how to study. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm frustrated. Lots of tears, lots of tissues, things like that. The year coordinator at the time who saw consecutive girls coming to her with the same problem again and again. And it was really contributing to the academic stress. So schools often have students in categories for well-being of people that present with academic stress and then people that present with larger, more persistent problems that can be diagnosed. And so the beauty of students presenting with academic stress is that it can be alleviated. We can fix that. Whereas things like anxiety and depression, we can't necessarily wave a magic wand within our roles at schools, but definitely with self-regulated learning and the sort of positive effects that can come from that, we can have an impact on students' well-being.
Rebecca, that's fascinating. I had the pleasure of speaking at University of Queensland's Learning Lab Symposium last year in November. And I was listening to Professor Paul Dux speak about the horizons, and they've been doing kind of longitudinal study around academic well-being. Mm-hmm. And they've been looking at specifically transition points in school. So, within school, there's multiple transition points. And what they've found is that metacognitive ability, so fundamentally self-regulated learning, because metacognition is the core part of self-regulated learning, is the strongest predictor of academic well-being. So it just makes sense that what you're seeing in terms of academic stress, that you chose a focus on self-regulated learning as perhaps an obvious pathway to try and support students at your school. That makes sense to me.
It does. And I think that when you're in a school, you see it immediately. So you see a real life child come in crying and she says directly, I am stressed because I can't study. I have all these pressures. I don't feel capable. And so I think that the school, I don't think had necessarily a research-backed kind of view of why that might be the case or the solutions necessarily, but they're able to go on a sort of, I guess, a real life diagnostic right? As if you have 30 girls out of 100 come into your office crying, there's probably some kind of problem there, and it's something you probably can fix, if you just have the right tools. So it wasn't until later that the people involved in the project, including myself, realized just how much the research does actually back that up, that it is a known issue, and that sort of self-regulated learning skills, they affect a real suite of different student traits and attributes like persistence, like optimism, like negative or positive emotions and things like that. So I think it was a really good, a good example of where we're able to solve a real life school problem by taking action. And I think that the school, there was a bit of luck involved that the research is already pretty good around that. But I think ours makes a pretty good contribution to how to enact that within a real school setting.
Yes, yeah. And Rebecca, from memory, your study focused heavily on Year 9 and 10 students. Was that because of the number of students that were presenting with this sort of academic stress from those year levels, or was that just an opportune kind of year level?
So I think that the anxiety does start to increase around that particular age. So that age within adolescence is a trigger point for those sorts of conditions. The other thing is that if you leave it till 11 and 12, it's a little bit too late. So I think that year 11 and 12 is potentially where it's going to have the more immediate impact and maybe a bit more buy-in and motivation. But it's really too late to start teaching intensively a lot of new skills by that stage. I think you're much better off working on them from when they're younger and then doing top-ups as they get into year 11 and 12. I think year 7 and 8 are still trying to find their pencil case. And I think potentially like a self-regulation approach for year 7 is going to look quite different to a research-backed approach that relies on memory and very, very particular strategies. So that's why there's a number of reasons. I think as well, just from a practical perspective, it's a bit easier to access year 9 and 10 rather than year 11 and 12 within the timetable. Yeah. So we're not taking away from content. We're able to sort of integrate that or take time out from curriculum to discreetly teach those skills.
Yes, yeah. Now, Rebecca, the SMART study program, as I understand it was a 3-year study and it was quite large scale, and we only have 20 minutes.
Yeah, so, it was 2, but we're going into the 3rd year now, so we're rolling it out from 7 to 12 in different forms.
Oh, amazing. Okay. And we have a lot of teachers actually in our audience for this podcast. So what I was thinking, Rebecca, is that we might focus on the teaching approaches in this conversation. And if you're happy to join us for another episode, we could do a bit more of a deeper dive on the broader high-level leadership of.
Yeah, great. Sounds good. Yeah.
So maybe we can start there. What was sort of involved from a teaching perspective?
So you're probably aware of this, but there's not a lot of instruction for pre-service teachers on how memory works and specifically study. I think it's seen as potentially something things might have changed, but outside the remit of teachers to teach what students do outside the classroom. So we've got our hands full, I think, with what we do inside the classroom. Yep. And then to add that is a lot for teachers to take on. So teachers, I think, including myself, don't necessarily know what the high impact strategies are. They weren't taught within their pre-service teacher education. They probably weren't taught when they went to university, and now they're teaching students and having to equip them to study successfully so that they can go on to tertiary again. So it's this cycle of people along the chain not really knowing. As a school, we had to really investigate what is the research around effective study practices and how does that work within cognitive science. When we started the project, I didn't really know what those strategies were, but we did a really deep dive on what are the strategies that are proven to work. And there's a fair amount of pretty consistent research around that. So things like retrieval practice is the big one, actually retrieving things from memory and then making that more effortful in different ways. So they're all strategies that help us to secure those bits of information in long-term memory. So Robert Birch describes them as desirable difficulties. Desirable difficulties are things like spacing out your practice instead of chunking it or blocking it. Instead of engaging in this mass cramming, we space out our practice over particular days in different subjects to make that learning more effortful. And the more effortful it is, the more likely we are to remember it. Other things like interleaving, so jumbling up the topics, is another way to make it more effortful. There's other little things like not studying in the same environment all the time, changing up the room or the conditions, or even the people who are around you. They can be additional challenges that you can set to make those memories that retrieval more effortful and the memories last longer. So part of the program was actually sharing with students the cognitive science behind why the strategies work. So we know that students rely on strategies that are not effective. We know they rely on things like highlighting and rereading. So for students to even see, so using something like a Menti to survey them, and they can see that they use all these ineffective strategies that feel very productive. If you end up with a page of highlighting or you've done an hour of reading, you feel like you've achieved something, you're nailing it, when in fact those strategies don't actually work well. They lead to a really superficial and almost like an illusion of knowing rather than really knowing that content. Part of the program was to share that research with them. I think with girls, they find it credible if you share research with them. Whereas we have a critical friend in Brisbane who said with the boys, they just don't care. They just want to be taught the strategy. So that was interesting to think about genders and how much you have to do to persuade boys versus girls. Yes. And then teaching them those strategies explicitly. So we had this big advantage of having a 20-minute session set aside every week for 3 times. Having that time means you can, really step it out. So you can teach, you can model, you can embed it within subject content, and you can give a bit of time for students to apply what you're doing. So we taught them explicitly, giving templates, giving time, giving workbooks, things like that, so students could actually have that time to apply their learning. And then we had sessions closer to exams where they were able to actually use those strategies and use them in the presence of their tutor. So one of the ways we got less variance in the teaching was to have one teacher out the front to 200 kids. So I realized that's not going to be possible in a lot of settings. So we have the space and time to do that. And I think if you don't have all teachers on the same page, you don't get the fidelity of the teaching. Part of our program was predicated on the idea that it was a wellbeing program, not an academic program. So our grant that we got through the AIS, the Association of Independent Schools New South Wales, was that we were going to lift student wellbeing. And so that was the space that we put this particular program. So it was really important to us that it was seen as a wellbeing program. But if you're going to get teachers to teach it, you might get a lot of variance between tutors in potentially how committed they are to the project, how much teaching expertise they have with regard to what the strategies are and how to teach it. For fidelity, it was easier to get one person to teach it.
Rebecca, I might jump in there because I think what you've raised is really interesting. And based on my understanding of the literature, and I think it was written in your report, there's an importance in making sure that we teach these strategies in subject context. Mm-hmm. How did you achieve that if you had teachers teaching a large group for 20 minutes around these strategies that, like, I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. How did you achieve that?
So there's a few different ways we achieved that. In the first year, we had a suboptimal approach to how we're going to do that. We embedded all the strategies in content-specific examples. We sometimes got guest teachers from a particular subject to deliver that content. So for example, if we're doing examples in geography on note-taking, say Cornell note-taking, we'd get a geography teacher to deliver that lesson using geography content. The reason I say it's suboptimal is that we weren't able to really embed it in things the students were doing at the time. So we would get a generic geography example. That first year, we were sort of chasing our tails trying to actually implement, rushing around trying to get things ready and not quite knowing what we were doing, a bit of trial and error. I think that approach was okay for that time. But yes, they're embedded in content knowledge. What would be another example? We might consult with a mathematics teacher to get the mathematics flashcards right, things like that. I think because the girls weren't using that content, they weren't able to transfer the idea of using it for that subject to their homework, say that night. They'd be, we did this 6 months ago. I'm not quite sure what I would do with that today.
Yes.
So the second year, what we did was we invited subject heads or teachers to present on content the students had done that week. So you can imagine in a big school, that's actually really hard to organize, getting around to subject teachers and saying, what did you teach yesterday? We have to design a lesson that capitalizes on what they did 24 hours ago. It's work intensive with trying to catch busy teachers and engage people in being part of the program, but really worthwhile. I think there was an aspect of the second year that I think worked really a lot better than the first, because students were able to say, okay, we did romanticism yesterday in English, and now we're doing a brain dump on romanticism in English. They're able to see, when I go home, this is a strategy I can use. Yeah. Whereas that leap between something they did 3 months ago and a strategy they learned that day is just too big a leap.
Can I ask, because one part of the research that I remember reading has been around that transfer. And so I'm really curious then, because it's kind of closer in proximity to their content now, were the teachers or were the students, and you might not have collected data on this, transferring, were the teachers observing kind of that transfer into their lessons where the students were saying, oh, well, this would be a good opportunity to do a brain dump or a retrieval practice grid, or I don't know.
Students were given guidance around broad domains. All right. So if we gave a certain strategy, we would say, this is helpful in mathematics-like subjects. So mathematics adjacent, if you're doing a bit of chemistry or whatever in year 10, something like that, this is a good strategy to use. And then we'd have a suite of strategies in the humanities domain. So we're talking about sort of subject specific, but also can be transferred within a domain. And when I say domain, I mean something quite broad, not a specific subject.
Yeah.
And what we had with the teachers was a really organic uptake of the strategies. So around the same time, we were going down an explicit teaching path, upskilling teachers about memory and evidence-based practice and cognitive science around the same time. And one of the professional learning sessions we did was on the do now. So the do now is where students walk in, there's an activity on the board that's some kind of retrieval. They walk in silence, they sit down, they start it straight away. And what I think happened was that teachers were able to see the efficacy of that straight away. So it's a very low buy-in activity because it takes almost no time to create. So if they're learning something like a brain dump in Smart Study, that doesn't require a lot of prep for the teacher. They write on the board, do a brain dump on yesterday's lesson. There's a low barrier to teachers taking up these practices, which is great. An unexpected result is teachers who were not involved in the study started to do these kinds of activities. And I was in charge of professional learning. Just for my own knowledge, I did survey the girls on how many teachers were doing these activities. And we got pretty good uptake. Actually, the girls were reporting that they did them in, I think it was something like 40% of lessons, which I think for a school where no one's told you must do a do now, I think that's a pretty good result. And the girls were also able to articulate why it was helpful for them. So I would say something like, how does this help your learning and or motivation? And they were surprisingly articulate. I could have written some of the responses myself. And I think that was the sort of product of the whole school heading in a particular direction. I think when you prioritize a big project like that, it does have organic impact on teaching practice as well. And again, because the strategies are effective for two reasons. One is that students potentially remember more. But the second reason they're effective is because they're a very quick and easy form of formative assessment at the start of the lesson. If you've set a retrieval activity for a monthly review and no one can do it, you've got great formative assessment data. You might think, oh God, they don't remember anything, but that's a signal for you with your teaching is that, okay, they need to revise. That's fine. Like a good teacher will be glad they found out, not disappointed in their teaching.
Yes. Rebecca, I'm conscious of time, as we always have on this podcast, but I feel like we're only just scraping the surface. So I'm going to put these in the podcast notes because I'm going to put the links to the report and the website, because on the website, you've actually been very generous. Queenwood's been very generous with sharing the templates that you've used for this month. Is that right? That's what I've kind of seen on the website.
I think, yeah, we've got the sort of like almost like consumables, that you can hand out to teachers and kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's fantastic. So teachers in our audience, if you're keen to action some of these strategies in your class, or you want to do a bit of a deeper dive into what those strategies were, there's resources available, and I'll link them in under the podcast notes. But Rebecca, now we get to our kind of favorite part of the podcast, which is our little on the reg segment where we get to share some self-regulated learning strategies. We would love to hear what's a strategy that you personally use to self-regulate your learning.
Mine's actually simple, and I can show you because it's sitting right here. I've got this little friend, which is a clock. It's a visual timer. Actually, you can see it. It counts down visually from 45 minutes. You can use it for Pomodoro or things like that. So Pomodoro is where you set shorter bursts of learning and have a little break and have a reward. I actually have this to stop working. That might sound opposite to a teenager, where a teenager is like, oh, I'm going to set it so that I can sit here for 45 minutes and not get up. I'm more like, I have to get up. I must get up because I think I've got pretty good metacognition around when I'm getting into a deep hole that is unproductive with my writing. I have this so that I have a mental break and refocus and get back to it with more clarity at the end of a session. That's my self-regulated learning clock. So they use them in special ed a lot to keep kids focused. You don't need to tell the time to see how much time you've got left. And it's just been a godsend. I've got one at work and one at home.
Fantastic. I have to admit, I use a timer on my phone whenever I work in blocks. Pomodoro typically is kind of 25 minutes with a 5-minute break. I find actually for me, I work better in 40-minute blocks with a 10-minute break. It's great to see, people just adapting the time and how it works for you. And I think that's important, isn't it? Applying, not taking your strategy as it is, but thinking about how it works for us. It's great to hear we share similar strategies in using a timer, and I'm sure many people do, but it's always nice to be reminded, isn't it? Well, Rebecca, that brings us to the end of the episode, at least for this time. Thank you so much for joining me this time, and we'll continue the conversation in our next episode. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me.
If you are a new listener to the podcast, make sure you share it with friends, save it, or subscribe. If you have any questions, and we really want to hear from our listeners, if you have any questions or comments, send us a DM through either of our social media channels, which is Twitter and Instagram at Ed to Self-Reg. As always, to you and everyone else out there, keep regulated.